Hello everyone. I'm planning to look into the life of a few famous missionaries and how they were dedicated and useful for his ministry. Let's begin with my favorite of them all.
David Livingstone. David Livingstone was born in Scotland in 1813. He was a medical missionary. He wanted to go to China at first, but the door to China was shut by the Opium War. Within 6 months, he met Robert Moffat, who was a missionary in Africa, and Moffat led Livingstone to go to Africa as a medical missionary. He faced many hardships. Once he was attacked by a lion, resulting injury to his left arm. Mary Moffat, Robert Moffat's daughter, nursed him at the time, and eventually he married her. His life was that of an explorer. He would travel from place to place and share the gospel.
Mary accompanied him on many of his journeys until her health, and when one of their children died, it forced him to send her and their 4 children back to Britain. The next time he saw his wife was 5 years later. The only way they could communicate those days were by sending letters, and it would take months to get them. And when she saw him 5 years later, she could not recognize him. He was completely blinded in one eye from a tree branch. His face burned under the African sun, his face scarred, and one of his shoulders torn by a lion attack, and a limping leg. He was completely disfigured. In little over a year, he left to Africa again by himself. And finally, after a few years, Mary decides to join him, and sadly she contracted malaria and she died few days later. The very day that he buried his wife and he went home, he realized that somebody had stolen his medication that he so needed. And while he was praying, he had a visitor, and that was Henry Stanley, a press reporter who says these famous lines to him. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" He says, "I'm here to write a story about your life, and I want you to know 2 things about me. 1, I'm the biggest atheist in the world. 2, somebody has given this medication for you." And there it was, one of the biggest atheists in the world bringing the medication for David, which is the Lord's doing. Mr. Henry was traveling with Livingstone, and 4 months later, the biggest atheist knelt down and gave his life to Jesus. The power of that Christ life was awesome, and I had to get it. David's health had been poor for many years, and one day after he preached in a village, he was carried to his home, and he knelt down to pray, and few hours later they realized that he had died, kneeling at the bedside with his head buried in his hands upon the pillow. He lived a life of prayer and gave his life to be used by the Lord and led many to Christ. He spent almost 30 years of his life as a missionary. Here are some of the popular books written by David Livingstone for further reading. David Livingstone lived his life as a vessel honorable to God for his ministry. I hope his life has touched and inspired you as much as it did to me. I'll be back next month with a new missionary story. Until then, stay blessed.